This is the Debunking Economics podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 16. Growth. Do we really need it?
This time on the Debunking Economics podcast, growth. Do we really need it? Well, capitalism is based on it. It seems growth is good. Staying put is bad. In fact, worse, it destroys wealth, we're told. So why is that? Why can't we have stable incomes, stable consumption, and expect our living standards to remain the same? In fact, over recent years, living standards for many people have been falling, even though the economy is growing, we're told. So Professor Steve Keen is here with us again. So do we need growth for the economy to function properly, or is it just psychology that we like to think we have more money, and if the economy keeps on growing and prices keep on going up and our house price keeps on increasing, we somehow feel as though we're better off? Is it psychological, or is there a deep underlying mathematical reason, Steve?
It's a bit of both. It also comes down to the distribution of income, because if you had if you look at the level of effective income and net wealth that we had in the global economy per capita, if you just divide the entire amount we produce of the head of every living soul every living human soul on the planet, and then look at that what it was in 1800, and now look at what it was today, we're about 4 times better off than we were back then. But of course, there are still people who are starving to death. There are still massive inequalities, and there are plenty of billionaires there that if you attempted to force feed them with every single possible commodity that they could buy between now and when they're likely to, if they had like a 20 years life expectancy, if you tried to get them to consume that stuff at the rate that would get them to zero by the time they reached a life expectancy, they'd literally explode. There's simply no way they can consume everything they've accumulated. So the part of the reason why economists are so fond of lobbying for economic growth is that if you do get growth, then you don't need to worry as much about distribution. But if you don't get growth, and that's the situation we're in now, then distribution becomes absolutely to the fore, and that's why they're in panic mode right now.
Yeah, but let's just, we'll examine that again in a second, but just in terms of this idea of how much wealth and how much better off we really are. I'm in a house that, it's about 100 years old. Someone's lived in this house on and off for 100 years. Let's go back 20 years. Whoever was living in this house, they probably had a TV in the corner like I have. It might have been not as big as the one I've got now, but they still had a TV, they had a car, the kids went to school, they probably ate a similar amount as I'm eating now, so I'm not any better off, and yet everything's costing more.
Well, in fact, that's true for most people who've got a working class to middle class income, particularly when you look in America. The actual real pay that American workers got peaked in about 1970. So they've really been stuck in a groove going nowhere for going on half a century now, which is why the American working class has gone from being absolutely happy and gung-ho and pro the American system to being cynical and throwing the human hand grenade that Donald Trump is into Washington. So there's been half a century where that would have been true. But if you go back and look at what's actually given us the wealth, this is the thing that economists, unfortunately, don't understand, like so much else. Really what gives us extra wealth is the extra exploitation we're doing and usage of energy. When you look at what production is really doing, it's if you go back 200 years, the people in our equivalent situation were writing with fountain pens by candlelight. And in that sense, the number of photons that they were able to absorb at night to continue writing their magnum opuses, the principles of political economy for David Ricardo and so on, the number of physical photons were falling on the paper he was writing on was substantially lower than you and I can generate now by flicking on an LED light.
Well, you might not agree. You might not agree with him. You've got to admire his dedication for writing it by candlelight.
Oh, totally, and Marx in particular. I mean, God Almighty, the stack of paper that guy wrote. So yes, it is you've got to admire them. But the thing is, they were doing it with far less energy per capita than we're absorbing right now. And there's a wonderful piece of work by the United States Energy Commission taking a look at energy consumption in America right back to 1650, and then fitting that to the per capita standard of living, and it's almost a perfect fit. Right. The amount of energy and the amount of watts per hour that we absorb has really been the driver of the amount of wealth that we have. And that is what's unsustainable in the long run. This is what economists simply don't get.
Which goes back to my question: do we need to continue to have growth for the economy to survive? And let's look at that question of sustainability, because I know what the neoclassic economists' answer to that is, because they, like me, probably grew up reading the Club of Rome report, that was going to have us all starving to death by now. But then innovation apparently has made us able to make more use of the resources we have available. And there's talk that, well, that's only going to go so far. We're going to reach a stagnation point, but we get beyond that, and we seem to continue to innovate and make more out of the resources that are available on the planet. So that's always the argument that's given back, isn't it? That, well, it's not sustainable, but we're going to make more out of what we have, so that sort of makes it sustainable.
And that's why it's wonderful to see what physicists do when they actually take an economist apart on this front. There's a wonderful blog post I recommend people to take a look at called Exponential Economist Meets Finite Physicist. And it's written by the physicist who happened to find himself next to a fairly famous economist, and then started grilling the guy on what he understood about the laws of thermodynamics. And this, for physicists were saying there are physical limits, and the economists are saying, no, they're not. We can innovate, we can change, we'll always be improving. And the physicist points out, so okay, let's assume you're right. You can actually do that. What then happens on the planet itself? And he wasn't talking global warming at all. He was saying, imagine there's no such thing as global warming. Or the temperature of the planet simply reflects the amount of heat being generated on the planet directly, not captured by anything. Because exploiting energy necessarily involves waste. You are dumping waste heat just by it's the simple laws of thermodynamics, which are not simple, but they're very incontrovertible. You simply cannot get around them. If we continue to the current rate of energy consumption, which is growing at about 3% per annum, even if you look at like a stable population, so the population stopped growing and you're only growing at about 2% per annum, that means you're doubling the amount of energy you're pumping out every 35 years. And he uses the example of a rate of growth of 2.3%. What that means is that every century you're using 10 times as much energy as you were the century before. He said, if we keep that up, forget about global warming, nothing to do with global warming, simply the byproduct of the usage of energy, the amount of waste energy we need to radiate out of the planet will be equivalent to the boiling temperature of water in about 400 years.
Right. So that gets back to the question, though. Are we, it's not sustainable. Why do we need growth? And going back to your point about, well, growth is there to try and equalize the spread of income. How is that so when, I gave the example and your answer was, there's a lot of people like me who are probably no better off than they were 10 or 15 years ago, and yet the economy has grown. Clearly, growth has fallen to the top echelons of society. They're grabbing all the money, aren't they?
Exactly. And that's what we have to be aware that capitalism will do that, unless you have distributive mechanisms in the opposite direction that capitalists tend not to like. Yeah. But the only way we can maintain human society is if you don't have revolts all the time. And Nick Hono's comment about the pitchforks are coming is quite justified, because of, over half, in terms of looking at the state of living of American workers, something like 70 to 80% of the population hasn't benefited out of the last 50 years of economic growth.
Right.
So and because a substantial part of that's actually gone backwards.
Because capital accumulates. And so isn't the answer then, and this is, economists would hate this idea, but isn't the answer that you then say, well, okay, you've got to redistribute. Probably hefty taxation is the way to do that. The answer to, for people who are earning a lot of money, the answer to that is going to be, oh, that's not a good idea because that's a disincentive for them to innovate, and they're the wealth creators. But if that slows down the rate of growth because those people are now not getting as much money, so what? How does that change things?
Well, I think the whole problem about taxation is it does make people angry about it. I've ended up getting it taken away. And in fact, we don't have to do that. You can actually use the state's capacity to create money to actually, rather than taxing, you spend, but you don't spend on the wealthy, you spend on the working class, you spend on the poor. and the middle class with a basic income, which matters far more to them than it does to the upper echelons.
Right.
And that has the same effect.
But you're doing that to create growth. You're doing that so you're giving money to people so they spend, therefore they spend more, therefore we consume more, which keeps that growth going in the economy. But we still have that sustainability issue that you mentioned.
Yeah, well, the sustainability to me, and I'm going to sound like a bit of a space cadet here, and I'm quite happy to sound that way.
Good.
The only way we're sustainable in the long term is to take production off planet. And we're literally getting to the stage where that's becoming a feasible thought. Certainly in the next century, we could have factories in space.
Right, you are sounding a bit like a space cadet now.
Yeah, I'm quite happy to do it. We're within 10 years potentially of having a colony on Mars.
Right, but why? Why? So because by the way, I have no problem with having the same living standard I had 10 years ago, and I suspect most people don't. So, if they can have a happy life, they're happy not to see growth. Yeah. They're happy for things to stay the way they are. Why do we need the growth? Isn't there a way that the economy can continue to function without this desperate need to grow?
It could, because if we got to the stage where everybody got a decent standard of living, and that really means a decent share of the energy we're exploiting, because that's fundamentally where our wealth comes from. Yeah. Then we would have, a quite comfortable society in the long term. So the growth focus is there because, it comes back to the psychology issue you mentioned at the beginning. I remember the discussions about apparently Larry Edison, I think was the owner of Oracle, was overheard talking about the yacht that he had. And when he found that it wasn't Bill Gates, but one of the other multi-billionaires had a bigger one, he wanted to have a bigger one than the other guy.
Yeah, despicable, isn't it?
It's what Veblen called conspicuous consumption.
Yeah.
Or Thorstein Veblen. If anybody hasn't read any Thorstein Veblen, just look up that phrase. He's a wonderful writer from the late 1800s, early 1900s, who was castigating both American culture but also American economics. Yeah. And he said that a huge part of what drives this behaviour of the acquisitive class, as he called them, was conspicuous consumption. Now, if for example, I know a guy who owns a 160-foot yacht, which has a baby grand on it, and it's a racing yacht. The reason he owns it is because the smaller one, which is only 120 foot, wasn't fast enough.
Is he happy?
And couldn't fit the baby grand. Yes, actually, he's quite a happy guy.
Because he's stinking rich. Of course he's happy.
He's stinking rich.
But would he be any less happy if he had half the wealth or a quarter of the wealth or even 100th of the wealth?
Not by a lot, well, except that he's trying to consume himself against global warming. He actually knows it's happening, and he's built his own island, which is completely energy self-sufficient. But if we then have a redistribution from that sort of society, what do we all do with our share of a 160-foot yacht?
Well, we don't have the yacht. That's the that's the thing. We don't need the yacht. And that's
we're living in a gilded age where the inequality, which is driven again largely by my favourite topic of debt and leverage of asset prices, has been driven by that, and we therefore have this incredible inequality where we simply even can't redistribute what's being created out of that excess inequality. So, and now we're realising by looking around the globe that inequality, people used to think, well, capitalism needs inequality so people innovate. There's partial truth to that, without a doubt. But at the same time, there's excessive levels of inequality we've generated now mean people no longer trust the system. They no longer accept the levels of wealth that the highly wealthy people accumulate, and you start getting social breakdown coming out of it. And we're really seeing the beginning of it right now.
Well, we are.
So unless we wake up, we're in big trouble.
So we're still, we still have capitalism. It's the best system, we've got for now. But capitalism really does rely on growth, doesn't it? I mean, if we were to say, look, around the world, if all the leaders of the world said, look, we need to distribute wealth, but we don't need this whole growth thing going on. Plus we want innovation. We want a way that, we can do things better. Like, for example, getting more out of the energy we consume. But also, innovation that makes our life a little bit better. We still want that sort of stuff going on. But we don't want all the money that comes from that innovation to go to the top echelons of society. We want it to be shared around. I sound like such a socialist advocate here, which I think is exactly what I'm talking about. But can you do all of that while still working with capitalism?
You can. I mean, capitalism is one of my good mates, George Cooper, who's a physicist who used to work for Goldman Sachs and is now a critic of mainstream economics and actually established his own bank recently called Equitable in London, George argues that capitalism, when you look at it properly, is something which involves a state. It is not independent of the state. And what makes a capitalist system work well as the capacity for individuals to accumulate large amounts of wealth through innovation, you also have a redistributive mechanism in the government's capacity to spend and to tax. Now, I think the taxing side of things it falls over. If you understand the way that the government can create money in the same way that banks create money by spending more than it gets back in taxation, it can actually spend its way to do that redistribution rather than relying upon taxation to claw it back off people. No, so it's feasible. That could cause all sorts of other issues. I'm not saying it's issue free.
We've gone full circle in this conversation because my answer to that was, but isn't that going to create growth, and isn't that going to mean that we're using up more of the planet's resources?
Again, there we have to look at what is sustainable for us and the use of those resources, which we haven't done. And that's something which is very difficult to do with capitalism, because one of the great secrets of the success of a capitalist is to, of course, privatize your gains and socialize your losses. And of course, the classic there, of course, is the way we've treated the atmosphere, and this is particularly happening in China. And in fact, you can't incorporate that in the price system. A lot of the neoclassicals would argue just get the prices right, you'll get rid of what they call externalities. You can't price it properly, because if you actually price the entire cost of production, you get a loss, because that comes back to one of these other laws of thermodynamics, the second law that says the usage of energy creates more disorder than order. The only way we get what looks like more order out of it is we extract the energy and refine products and go for disordered raw materials to ordered final products. But the waste we generate, when you add it all together, necessarily has to be more disordered. If you charge for that waste, that may make a loss. So we simply can't price system our way out of it. We have to regard ourselves as mining the energy and then say, how much can we afford to mine in terms of ecological sustainability, and how can we distribute that? And that's why I think ultimately the only real solution for us as a species is to remove the danger that production generates for the biosphere. And that's a danger which, even if the global warming skeptics were correct, and believe me, I'm gagging as I say that, in 400 years we'd still need to do something about it, because I don't think anybody wants the average temperature of New York to be 100 degrees Celsius.
No. Well, it'd be nice in winter, wouldn't it, to be a few degrees warmer. I love the expression, privatize your gains, subsidize, socialize your losses. We need to try and turn it around the other way, don't we? Maybe that's, part of the fundamental problem. But it seems that almost anything we have to do to try and redistribute wealth, it means we have to be much more heavily interventionist in our approach.
Yeah, well, we have to, and this is what I recommend George's writings on this front. Democracy is a feedback system that keeps capitalism sustainable. The money turns over and goes back to where it can be respent again. Whereas if we just have the raw capitalist system with the financial system backing it up, you tend to get massive accumulations of wealth and massive levels of private leverage, which lead to financial crises like the Great Depression and 2008. And we simply have to wake up to ourselves about the nature of the system here, get past ideology and say, if you want a sustainable future, you need to have some redistribution built in, as well as the generation of wealth in the first instance. And you've also got to look at what we're doing with energy, which is still something which we're being incredibly ignorant about, and we're going to be paying for it really probably in the next 2 decades.
Well, in the next 2 decades, let's go halfway through that. Let's go 10 years in advance. Are we still going to be saying the wealth of a nation is determined by its GDP per capita, or are we going to find a better measure? Like, how happy are people? That would be quite a good measure, wouldn't it?
Well, the Bhutan apparently runs itself by a national happiness index. I mean, one of my biology friends made the comment once that economics is the only profession that adds up its assets and liabilities and calls that wealth.
Yeah.
So there are negatives we need to subtract from the state of living we have. For example, pollution levels in London. I don't know if you get the plume reports all the time, but they tell you quite regularly it's not safe to go outside and breathe right now. That's London, let alone China.
Yeah.
Now,
it's always clear. So the air is clear in the Surrey countryside. You don't have to travel too far, Steve. It's 45 minutes on the train to clear air.
Okay, well, I hear this. The internet connections aren't quite as good, so I'll stay in London. But this is the problem. We don't properly measure the benefits we're getting out of the economy, and part of those benefits do really involve this little thing called social cohesion. And that's why, again, Nick Hanau's article about where the pitchforks are coming, I think is extremely apposite. we're turning a blind eye to the inequality that's causing a level of social breakdown, and we're turning a blind eye to the impact we're having on the planet as well. So, we're a marvelous species. We can innovate like crazy, but we also try to ignore the problems we're having in doing it. And we're reaching a real turning point there. I don't think we will be talking about it in 10 years' time, because that's enough time for some of the genuine dangers of global warming to well and truly bite. And we're going to be seeing that in climate catastrophes coming our way. So we're going to get a very rude wake-up call.
All right, let's hope it's not too soon, but I think you might be right. But I also know there will be a lot of economists listening who are saying, what a load of hogwash.
Of course. I'm very happy about that.
Job done. Good to talk, Steve. We'll see you again soon.
Okay, mate. Bye.
So I'm not totally sure of the answer. Maybe I'm just slow to catch on to this one, but it does sound, I mean, clearly redistribution is key. That is taken as read. But as to this question as to whether we need growth, I think Steve is saying it's fine so long as we take into account our consumption of energy. And that's the defining factor we need to control. If we can do more with the same energy or with less energy, why not have the growth so long as we all feel better off as a consequence, not just a few? Makes sense. Now, next time, why do we allow exchange rates to fluctuate? They used to be fixed. Now they float freely. Which system is better and why? That's next time on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Thanks for listening.